Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Meet VCU Authors. My name is Chris Shin. I'm an associate professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies and the associate director of the Humanities Research Center at VCU. I also direct the Health Humanities Lab at the HRC. Our Meet VCU Authors series invites members of the Richmond community, as well as colleagues and students from VCU and other universities, to meet VCU authors as they talk about their publications and answer questions about their work. It is also a time of celebration, as publications take many years to complete. Although from Christopher's pace, you wouldn't know that. Our virtual events follow a more or less similar format. I'll first introduce our guest, who will speak for about half an hour. Then we'll have time for questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A function or the chat to post your questions, and we'll field them in the order in which they're received during the Q&A. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce a friend and colleague who I've been really happy to work with in many different contexts, Christopher Brooks, who will be discussing his recent book, Dual Pandemics, HIV and the Coronavirus in Several Communities. Dr. Brooks is a professor of anthropology at VCU. He has produced numerous publications focusing on the African continental and diasporan experience, and is the general editor of the 1,600-page reference work, The African American Almanac, 11th edition. He is a contributor to the Encyclopedia of African American Culture, where he wrote the chapter HIV and the African American Church. That's from Greenwood Press. His other publications include chapters in the African and African American Religions and Religious and War volumes in the Religion and Society series published by Routledge in 2001 and 2003, respectively. He has a chapter celebrating the centennial of W.E.B. Du Bois's landmark publication, The Souls of Black Folk, 100 years later, entitled The Souls of Black Folk, Can a Double Consciousness Be Heard? From the University of Missouri Press, 2003, where he examined the prophetic statement Du Bois made about the crucial issue of the 20th century being the race question. And into the 21st, clearly, right? So Christopher's first book in 2024, The Tales of Kohler Hollow, an African-American family in rural Appalachia, was on Amazon's best-selling book lists for 3 weeks. An audio version of that book is about to go into production. He presented a talk in this series on that work last fall. Dual Pandemics, HIV and the Coronavirus in Several Kenyan Communities was released in August 2024, and he'll be speaking about that work today. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Brooks.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that introduction. And thank you all for coming out for this. This work was in the planning for several years before actually going into press, and I'll talk about that a little. Let me see. This book is actually the 5th in a series of HIV-related books that I've done over the past 15 years with Linus Press. The second one was called Through the Voices of Men, South African Men Speak About HIV. That book did so well that the press asked me to do an expanded second edition, which I was happy to do. And then the most recent, or the one just before this one, was on Muslim women in Mali, and called The Most Vulnerable: Women, HIV, and Islam in Mali. This current book was to have begun, and I apologize for the picture of myself, but I couldn't find the book cover, and so I had to grab the picture from the story that the VCU Press did, or VCU News did on me. But I would like to call to your attention that the cover art was done by an undergraduate student of mine by the name of Delaney Ludwig. And I want to call your attention to what is the shield there. She came up with an idea to make it into a heart, so you can see the ventricles at the top coming out the left and out the right. And she felt that it was an important statement or visual statement to make based on the the emotions of a number of those whose experiences are contained within this work. So this book, probably more than any other one that I've done thus far, involves students, undergraduates in the Honors College. I had the opportunity to take one of the anthropology majors, one of the honor college majors to Kenya to work as field assistants as well. Let's see. So Kenya, here we tend to see that idyllic with Mount Kilimanjaro in the background and the elephants and what have you. That's where it's located. And I don't want to insult anyone who might not know, but in any case, just to give a little context for it. And there is the current president of Kenya, William Ruto, and the major international metropolis, Nairobi, and which has all of the trappings of good and bad that goes along with a major international major city. Kenya is, and this year, just an aside, this marks the 40th anniversary of my first arrival on the African continent. I went for the first time when I was in my early 20s, and well, 40 years have gone by. So in any case, that's just another aside there. Now, with regard to HIV, Kenya has certainly more than many other countries that I've been in, and I've now been to 25 countries over these last 40 years. It took a more robust approach to the virus. According to the most recent statistics, there are about 1,400,000 cases of people living with HIV in Kenya, and close to 80 of those persons are in care. This was a statistic cited by, sadly, the USAID, which had a large footprint in that country, and which partnered with Kenya in a number of their activities. And of course, we've been keeping up with the press with how that's likely to be affected now. So again, another one of those casualties, if you will. Kenya joined along with the United Nations program on HIV/AIDS called UNAIDS with Project 95-95-95. And what that was, that by this year, 2025, 95% of people living with the virus worldwide will be diagnosed. 95% of those diagnosed should be in care, and 95 of those receiving ARVs should be virally impressed. Now, Kenya made strides to meet this goal. They're not quite up to that 95, but they're close to 90 in this point, which points to the rigorous approach. That said, socially and culturally, the country has had to deal with some vulnerable populations, and therefore it has there are certain parts of the Kenyan population which have been affected by that. For example, same-sex workers, who constitute a significant group among those carrying the virus, have often been disempowered or, frankly, not taken seriously. Related to that are adolescent girls who are uneducated, which often leads to them engaging in transactional sex work as a means of survival. Kenya understands the relationship between keeping girls in school and reducing their vulnerability to HIV. There are yet other issues like gender-based, or what we now, the expression we use is intimate partner violence, among others. And these are among the experiences that have been recounted in dual pandemics. Yet another one is same-sex relationships, specifically MSMs, or men who have sex with men. That activity is officially illegal in Kenya. And so men who have sex with men are often denied access to care or simply will not seek it for fear of social stigma, for harassment, or possible arrest. Now, I explored this phenomena in Mali, which of course is a majority Muslim country, where MSM relationships are not specifically banned, especially if they're not transactional. And as an Africanist, I concluded that in a number of Francophone countries, it reflects that colonial experience where the French were a little bit more progressive when it came to such issues than, let's say, the British were. And Kenya, of course, was a British colony. So in any case, there are countries like Uganda, Malawi, Nigeria, who have taken a very extreme stance when it comes to same-sex relationships and could even result in capital punishment or other cruel activities. So that is to say that I did not encounter or anyone who identified themselves in a dual pandemic. So I would say that is a drawback, if you will. South Africa was very different because South Africa has where marriage is described constitutionally in a way that will include same-sex relationships as well. So the stigma isn't as strong there. Now, the social manifestations of the virus and those who avoid being tested is fairly pronounced. This display, the chart, gives you an idea of where the HIV prevalence per county is in Kenya. The Homa Bay, Siaya, Kisumu, those are more rural places. Some are on the coastal area and what have you. And this is where you're likely to have, or that area surrounding Victoria, Lake Victoria, where it's still very rural, and hence you're likely to come in contact or the lack thereof of information surrounding the virus. And as you go down, you'll see a decrease in prevalence. And this is from 2022 or 3, as I recall. Now, in doing this, my informants also elected, at my encouragement, to not reveal their names, and in many cases, not their locations. Now, I worked with several hospitals while in Kenya, doing counseling or what have you, or testing, but again, I did not even say what hospitals I was working at or near or anything like that to protect the identities of my informants. Now, I also took note of the number of my informants in this work who had suicide ideation or made suicide attempts after their HIV diagnosis. Now, this points to an increased need for greater mental health availability and advocacy surrounding seropositive diagnosis and in general. Now, for someone who's been going to the African continent as long as I have, of course, I've heard throughout decades, this goes against the myth that continental Africans do not commit suicide and do not need mental health services. And this work, and not only this, you'll find a fairly lengthy literature indicating the opposite of that. And so hopefully this will bring attention to those two issues. Now, this work was initially supposed to have been done or started in 2020. In October 2020, of course, what was going on, the COVID-19 pandemic. And by March of 2022, things had calmed down a little, but this gives you an idea of the statistics of how many people were carrying that virus. But once again, Kenya took a very aggressive and active stance in how to address it. With Nairobi being the largest urban area in the country, that's where you got the largest number of infections. Kiambu is a county near Nairobi, Mombasa, which of course is the coastal city, and so on and so forth. Now, part of that aggressive position that Kenya took with regard to its fight against COVID, they put very strong restrictions in place. Like number one, restrictions were placed on entertainment facilities, including bars and other social spaces. Businesses were in this category were required to close to the public by 7:30 p.m. Strict social distance was of 6 feet or more was to be observed at all times. Supermarkets were required to limit the number of shoppers inside of its premises while observing that 6 foot social distance protocol. County governments were required to prioritize garbage collection and provide soap and water. Corporations and businesses encourage their employees to work from home when possible. Among other things, would be where public and private hospitals were concerned. They put very strict protocols on who could visit. A permission would have to be received a day or so in advance. It could only be close relatives, like a husband or wife, or a brother or sister, and for a limited time. And of course, mask protocol would be found throughout. And with regard to um, um, international visitors coming there, they had to be quarantined for 14 days prior to moving out. So the Kenyan government wanted to know where you were during that period, where you could be reached, etc., throughout that quarantine process. Also, where schools were concerned, they were closed. They were just simply closed. Children were not allowed to be outside unless they were being taken to a hospital by a parent or guardian. And these were some of the strict regulations that took place during that. Um, when I went in June and July of 2022, it was under a very strict protocol. I had to prove that I had tested negative, and the student that I took had to test negative, present that material at the airport at the time of entry. Also, before leaving Kenya, we were there about 2 weeks or thereabout. You had to be tested again to make sure you weren't carrying the virus when you left the country. So anyway, that was and in doing this, because this involved 3 different field trips, I always took my vaccination cards with me, and any of my informants, I happily showed it to them if they expressed interest, or if they wanted me to wear a mask, I said no problem, etc. All of those things. Now, what I found in this is that there were let me go advance the slides a little. This part of this program that Kenya put in place in order to combat the virus, right? And this is one of the hospitals that I worked at when while I was there. There were, as you might imagine, a number of folkways that we refer to them as surrounding the coronavirus, including, and probably that it was a conspiracy theory of some sort, either by the Russians or by the Chinese. A few said it was the Americans who were behind it. That it was the vaccination was a vehicle for implanting a device in people's bodies. And some said that if a young woman took the COVID-19 jab, as they refer to it, she would immediately go into menopause and lose her capacity to have children. The most frequent response that I came in contact with, however, was that if you took the shot, you could become a zombie. So, in any case, and how this manifested itself, particularly in that Kenya has these mass buses they call, but they're referred to as matatus, and they were also required to limit the number of people on. And this, some of them got a little amusing. One of my informants said if someone was on the matatu and sneezed, everybody would turn around and look at them. If they coughed, they would get even more scrutiny. If they made another cough, they would be forced off of the bus. So anyway, it was that serious, and people could be fined for flaunting COVID restrictions as well, and fined like the equivalent of $300 or thereabout. Now let's see, and I'm going to move on. Now, we treat, God heals. This was the philosophical position of many traditional healers. And more than in any previous work, now I've been looking at traditional healers in a good deal of my work, but I wanted to pay more attention to it because I've moved in that direction in terms of my own research. Here I am with another student from the Honors College who went on, and then Mr. John Musal, a traditional healer, and he was one of like 7 or 8 that I consulted while on this trip. They had their various ideas regarding the arrival of the coronavirus, and I am totally persuaded. They're called locally mgangas, and that they are the underappreciated and the under exploited, if I should say that, uh, resource in most African countries. The reality is that particularly Kenyans or continental Africans in rural areas, they are more likely to go to a traditional healer than they are to go to a Western practitioner. And why is that? Because the healers have the cultural congruence. They are really semioticians. They can, they will be the ones who will know that if you see chickens dying off, that could lead to some kind of mass action or some mass infection, or children having diarrhea, many of them, that it would be a sign of something, what have you. But they are not really utilized in the way that we would like. And that's one thing that I am working on right now to see their role expand. Here I am. Oh, let's see. Okay. Here I am with a student in 2023 with another healer just standing right beside me there. And let me see. And this was the trip in 2022. I had one of the anthropology majors with my Kenyan team there as well. And I think I'll go ahead and stop there. I do want to acknowledge several people with this to say, and I fail to include Dr. Faye Belgrave, who contributed a foreword to this work. And it was just, I was kind of fidgeting to get everything on and realize, but these are some of the offices and or programs here at VCU and elsewhere that assisted me in this process. I'll wrap up with one last thing, that there's a growing interest in support groups. I've seen support groups take place in South Africa among women. There are fewer support groups that involve all men, but I did attend two in Kenya, and they seem to be growing. And in my view, they help to address some of the mental health concerns that I encountered while doing this work. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thanks so much, Christopher. If people in the audience have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the webinar chat or in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Maybe as you're formulating your questions, I have some questions about how some of the differences maybe that you noted in the responses to HIV versus COVID in the Kenyan context, and especially as homosexuality becomes criminalized, homosexuality in scare quotes, or family values become affirmed as a way to assert post-colonial nationalism, specifically African identity against what's being positioned as the corrupting influence of the West.
Right.
So maybe just, I don't know, speaking a little bit about.
Well, in fact, Chris, I'll say, since I'm teaching a course on the anthropology of colonialism, but it's one of the things, or one of the points that I make, that tradition of demonizing and criminalizing same-sex relationships was largely brought by the colonists. Okay? Prior to their arrival, it wasn't looked down upon in many societies or what have you. It was just a part of human expression. You can find in Sudan a myriad of activities. Okay? So what happens? The British colonist comes in and says, "Oh, that's against the law. It's immoral." Da 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 da. So what happens? It is codified within the context of the country's laws, etc., and it goes from there, being codified, and in many cases, those laws are still in place. So it's what I would call an invented tradition. And there was a British, or maybe it was Zimbabwean historian who first used that term, an invented African tradition. And there are many of them, which were, in fact, an outgrowth of that colonial experience. The French, by the way, tended to be, as I said, a little bit more progressive when it came to such things. So you can find, and even in Mali, which is, as I said, over 90% Muslim, that there aren't those kinds of harsh penalties in place that you would find in Uganda. And Uganda is interesting as well, because see, who influenced them in recent times? I guess, I bet many won't be able to guess. American evangelicals going to that country, preaching and saying, "Oh, it's against God's law," etc., so on and so forth. So the African leaders, politicians, etc., take up that call.
Thank you. I know that actually in Mali, as well as Burkina and Niger, there's been passage of again, these laws are called, family offenses against public decency or anti-homosexuality laws. But that's I can drop something that's kind of interesting for people who might be interested. But there are a couple questions in the chat that I want to make sure we get to. The first is from Harry, Nugroho. Does the HIV in Kenya caused by substance abuse? If yes, it might be a triple pandemic.
I'm sorry. Ask that question again, please.
Um, does the HIV is the HIV in Kenya caused by substance abuse, or to what extent might there be
Oh,
a triple pandemic in Kenya if you're
okay.
talking about HIV, coronavirus, and substance abuse?
Yes,
Yeah.
substance abuse. Well, there is, but the numbers and you mean with regard to blood transfusions or intravenous activity. From what I was able to find, there's very little of that in Kenya. In fact, I am not as aware of an extensive literature that addresses that issue. The reality is that most contractions of the virus of HIV, where HIV is concerned, is through sex or through childbirth. Yes. So, in terms of blood-to-blood transfusions or intravenous or what have you, probably that is less so. But there are one or two cases in dual pandemics where the my informant believed that to be the case, though.
Thank you. We have another question from Charmaine Jones. Thank you so much for your informative presentation. I'm interested to know more about the impact of these dual pandemics on mental health in the Kenyan communities. We know that COVID anxiety, grief from loss of lives, and social isolation greatly impacted mental health in the US. How is this reflected in Kenya?
Well, thank you for that question. The impact was serious, and that's why I wanted to make the point that that myth, and it is a myth, that there is no need for mental health services or that it goes against African values and what have you, is a myth. There is a health group that I work with called the Oasis Health Group, and in addition, they are developing a whole component related specifically to mental health because they saw it in their practices coming in contact with um, patients, and that is also a role, Shemaine, where the mgangas or the traditional healers can play a greater role because they know the culture better than practically anyone. So that is a role that they could play as well if they are given such an opportunity. I hope I answered that question.
Thank you. Charmaine, if you want to follow up more, you can drop additional questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. We also have until Charmaine responds, we have another question from Mimi Winnick. Thank you for a fascinating account of your research. Could you say more about the term folkways you used to describe conspiracy theorizing around COVID in Kenya? Is this a term with a specific meaning in anthropology? Some great
Yeah,
disciplinary
yeah,
conversations
yeah.
here. Yeah, thank you.
We tend to use folkways, whereas in the past we use unflattering terms like, oh boy, I'm not even, yeah, folkways, superstition, or folk tales, or myth, or those kinds of things. So we folkways legitimizes those cultural expressions. So that's the context in which it's being used.
Thank you. Charmaine Jones, thanks you also for your response. Are there other, I don't want to monopolize Mimi writes, thank you so much as well for your response. I had a question just about discipline as somebody who's in the humanities and who does more kind of textual analysis and research, and at the same time moves in spaces not unlike maybe a kind of ethnographer. Can you talk a little bit more about your position as an African American anthropologist in African contexts and how you situate yourself in relation to your discipline, which has a long, as you mentioned, there's a long history. I mean, it emerged from colonial kind of encounters. And yeah, so I don't know if you could just talk a little bit about your experiences as an African
Sure.
American
Yeah.
anthropologist in
Yeah.
these. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. I would definitely say, Chris, that it has been to my benefit. All right. When I went to Nigeria, which was the first country that I went to in, I think like October of um, 1985. Yes, that was it, 1985. And my being an African American was a distinct advantage for me because and being a researcher, I was a doctoral student, and that was my first real field experience of them. And I was, relatively young and what have you. And um, there were a number who wanted to know what it was like for me being a an African American and living in America. And it became clear to me, this is a personal epiphany or what have you, even if you were to take me, and I was 23 or something like that, leave me in Nigeria for the next 40 years, I would still psychically be an American. And I would be looked at that way by a number of the citizens there. I used my being an American to my advantage in that when I didn't, let's say, I hadn't mastered the language, Yoruba, in that particular case, at the time, and there were certain protocols how you kneeled when with an elderly person. I would try it and mess it up. Now if I had been a Nigerian, they would have looked, say, oh, you have parents who didn't teach you well or what have you. So when they knew I was an American, they appreciated that I was making the effort to do so. But there were also a number of times when I felt, believe it or not, well, whatever, to defend America. How's that? Well, in sometime in the fall, this was during the Reagan administration, mind you, and the Reagan administration attacked Libya and killed one of Gaddafi's children or what have you. And it was almost like I was there, I was the American, there, and that I was supporting, what the president of the US was doing and what have you. And I just said after, being insulted a little, I said, I would say things like, probably I shouldn't, but I was young at the time. Would say things like, "Yeah, criticize it all you please, but if you got the chance to go there, you take it." So anyway, I mean, after a while, I would shoot back at that. But overall, it has been an advantage for me, I would say.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question from Charmaine Jones. The other connection I made was to the cancellation of school as a COVID precaution. You named the education of girls as an issue that impacts sex work and HIV infection. How did the closing of schools impact girls' vulnerability?
Um, that was a little outside the scope of what I was focusing on, Shemaine. Meaning I was aware of it, that it took place. Some actually moved their children to the village, if you will, outside of Nairobi, if they had the means of doing so. Some people actually, even while they had to keep their children at home, got tutors in to tutor their sons or daughters or young children or what have you, since they weren't. And so you would have those kinds of scenarios. But in general, the girl child, and this is not specific to Kenya, but the girl child tends to be second class in many African societies. And it's been an observation of mine for a long time that the boy or male child is likely to be given more opportunity, greater access, and and that's not even a continental African comment as well, but can happen in a variety of societies around the world.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for a few more questions if people want to drop them in the chat. And maybe while people are formulating their question, can you talk a little bit about how your work, you have this amazing kind of rich narratives, through your experience and through your work that can't quite fit into the more like the chart of, the number of people who are, quantified in a particular way. And can you talk a little bit about some of those gaps and how you seek to maybe supplement or draw attention to what isn't foregrounded in the more quantifiable charting or official accounts of pandemics globally, but in maybe Kenya in particular?
I'm gonna
And
need a little bit more specificity with that, Chris, if you could. When you
sorry, I
say
was sort of,
gaps, yeah, go
yeah, sorry,
ahead.
I was sort of like formulating that on the fly. And it's kind of a humanist. I guess it's a question about narrative or stories,
Mm-hmm.
like the telling of stories and how important
Right.
they are in
Oh,
supplementing the more kind of quantitative accounts of pandemics.
well, that's what anthropology does. Or whether you're a biological anthropologist or a cultural or sociocultural anthropologist or archaeologist or a linguist, we tell stories of the human experience. Biological anthropology, for example, tells the story of humans as biological organisms. Cultural anthropology tells the story of humans based on the lineage, the culture, the practices, etc. Archaeological anthropology tells the story of humans based on artifacts that they have left behind, to build a narrative, to tell how they lived, etc. And linguistic anthropology tells the human story based on how we use language and gestures and movement, but mostly language and gestures. So that is a a part and parcel of the discipline, although not all anthropologists look at it that way. But we are, in essence, telling something about that human experience and telling that story or that narrative. And in the course that I'm teaching, the survey of world pandemics, and of course that anthropology of colonialism course, you can't divorce, even when we're talking about the science of a pandemic or an outbreak or what have you, you can't divorce the human from that. As I say, with regard to HIV, the science or the natural sciences will address the virus. Okay, it will. But that doesn't mean that the spread is likely to stop because you have human beings who are involved. You have cultural practices that are related. You have other kinds of things that will still get in the way. Like in South Africa, for example, and I don't know if I've gone too far afield. In South Africa, there's some ethnic groups that do not officially recognize HIV. They feel that it is a some other extreme kind of condition or what have you. So those are the kinds of things that we have to be sensitive to, if you will, to those cultural understandings, those practices, etc. Because see, when I started going to the African continent in 1985, I ran into healers who said, "Oh, they could heal HIV," and I just kind of scoffed at it. Well, with age should come wisdom, and I don't say anything like that. I just simply say, well, here's how I was trained. Here is what I believe. Here's what I so and so and so. So I just simply explain what my background is, what I believe I can bring to it, what practices that I have been trained in order to address it. So, and that way I'm not dismissing their approach.
Right. Thank you.